You're listening to WCAT Radio, your home for authentic Catholic programming.
Well, hi, and welcome to another episode of the Examine Life of Phil. I'm Phil, and as I always seem to be saying now, this is my attempt to examine my life and encourage you to examine yours. This week, I'm going to be diving into the question of expertise and authority. That is, when is it okay and a good and right thing for you to trust the opinions of experts on a subject, and when is that the fallacy of appeal to authority, and what's the distinction therein? I want to do this because it seems to be a very relevant topic to a lot of what's going on nowadays. There's many polls, surveys, and studies that seem to show that trust in our institutions is at pretty much an all-time low, and not just the government and related institutions there, but institutions in general. And trust in expertise, people typically seem to be, how should I put this, very inconsistent and choosy about which experts they trust. They tend to just trust the experts who agree with them already and say there's something wrong with the experts that don't agree with them. And if you don't believe me, you can just read the internet and you'll see many examples of that. One of the things that brought this to the forefront in my mind, and mostly though, is that there's a group of people I've encountered on Facebook who are very skeptical of the claims of medicine and the medical community about how to deal with the coronavirus, about how deadly it is, how virulent it is, and many of them are now saying that they know better than the doctors and experts who are espousing that we should take it seriously for this and this reason, it kills this many people have been infected, etc. I've talked with at least one who actually claims that he knows better than the doctors about these kind of things. Now, I hope on the face of it that should trouble you, that there should be something about that you're like, wait, no, come on. You're not a doctor, you have no medical training, you have no expertise in the medical arena, and yet you're claiming you know better than the people who are there? Come on. But we should be able to do more than just saying to somebody like that, oh, come on. We should be able to explain where this is going wrong and why and how. So that's what I'm going to be diving into this time around. Now, to do this right, to dive into this well, I'm going to have to give you just a very brief overview of epistemology. I've talked about epistemology on the podcast before, but loosely speaking, it's the study of how it is that you have knowledge and that you know your knowledge is correct. Now, epistemology is actually a very deep and I think it's interesting, but it can be a very dry topic as well. And there's a whole number of different philosophical theories as to how knowledge works, what knowledge is, and so on and so forth. And I don't think we need to dive really deep into that here to make this work, but you need to have at least some basic understanding of it in order to understand why something is a fallacy and when it isn't a fallacy. Because questions like, well, who's an expert and who should I trust, those essentially are epistemological questions. They're questions about what's a good source of knowledge and what's not. So, very 5,000-foot overview of this, but in a loose sense, since about the time of Plato till about, I want to say about the 1950s and maybe 1960s, give or take in there, most philosophers thought that knowledge was justified true belief. That is, when you claim to have knowledge of something, you believe it. It's a thought in your mind that you believe, that you think that thought has a coherence with the real world external to your mind. So I believe I'm sitting here speaking to my microphone, recording my podcast. I believe that I'm doing that, and that's what I'm actually doing in the real world. There's a comparison between what's going on inside my mind and what's going on outside my mind. So that's what belief means in this context. So there's coherence there. And it doesn't necessarily have to be the case that, what's going on in the real world and what's going on in your mind matches perfectly. Like, it could just, maybe it matches 99% of the time. Maybe you see something move over in the corner of the woods and you know you just saw something move, but you think, oh, that was probably a bear. Well, you don't necessarily know it was a bear, so it can get kind of complicated when you dig down into the nitty-gritty of it. But that's just what coherence means here is you have a belief in your mind, you have a thought in your mind, and it matches up with the real world. Now, justified means that you came to that belief through reasons that are good. So in this case, and me sitting here talking and recording the podcast, I'm having that belief because that's what my senses are telling me. I'm hearing my own words as I'm talking. My eyes are seeing my computer, the monitors and the microphone, all my books that are piled up in the office here, etc., etc., etc. So, from that, my mind compiles the belief I'm sitting in the office recording my podcast. And, again, if you dive deep into epistemology, there'll be some people who question how much you can trust your senses, because there are times your senses can deceive you. You can hear things that weren't really there. You can see things out of the corner of your eye, turn around, it's not really there, and things along those lines. But generally speaking, most of the time, probably 95 to 99% of the time, you can trust what your senses tell you, for the most part. And this is heightened by the fact that we've got 5 senses and we can use them to check each other. You maybe hear something, but then turn around and see nothing's there. Well, maybe you were falling asleep and your mind was starting to play tricks on you. It does that to me sometimes. Generally speaking, when one of your senses is deceived or gives you bad information, you can use the other senses to check that and realize it's bad information. And then the other category, which is that the belief is true, meaning it really is the case. And in the case of me speaking in the microphone, well, that's just obvious. But like I was watching a documentary the other day about some trials and like people who were on trial for murder or for securities fraud and things along those lines. Well, you could have a belief about whether or not this person really did commit the murder or whether this CEO really did commit securities fraud. But is that necessarily true? And like that was one of the things I was wondering. Well, in the case of the murder, it was very clear that the guy actually did it. In the securities fraud example, it was kind of up in the air whether the CEO actually did commit securities fraud. Now, you can have a belief about that, but is it true? Did the CEO really commit securities fraud? And obviously people who were involved in it had very strong opinions one way or another, and the CEO maintained his innocence, of course, because they always do. But you can have a belief about that, but is it actually true? And there it's not quite as easy to see that, and I'm sure you can see the distinction there. It's very easy for me to say, it's true I'm sitting here recording my podcast. If I were to claim, on the other hand, it's true that this specific CEO committed securities fraud in this particular context at this particular time, well, that's a harder claim to sustain. And I probably should have used my earlier examples of correspondence with the world outside of your mind for this example, because that's really what truth is. It's correspondence with reality. But I was trying to get the point across there that belief in this context doesn't just mean some random thought you have. It means you really believe that's something about the world. And it's not just like religious beliefs like I believe that God exists. It's things like I believe I'm drinking a cup of coffee. I believe I have 2 children. I believe I'm married to my wife Sarah, and on and on and on you go. Virtually everything we think and talk about in relation to the real world, it could be classified as beliefs. And a better analogy there would probably be like, well, I sometimes like to think about fictional stories, like I love the Lord of the Rings movies. But I don't for a second believe those are stories that actually happened. They're not history. So maybe that's a better analogy to help you see that. So, point being, for the longest time, people thought that pretty much from Plato until Edmund Gettier published a paper about Gettier problems, most philosophers thought that knowledge was justified true belief. Now, when Gettier published that paper, what he did is more or less showed there are instances where you can have things that pass the muster on being justified, true, and beliefs, but where it seems like there's something wrong, where it seems like that shouldn't really count as knowledge. And he was able to figure out some examples there where, yeah, that's a justified true belief, but there's still something wrong. There's still a reason why we think that shouldn't count as knowledge. So I was at an epistemology conference a few years back, I think 2 or 3 years ago now, and there were professional philosophers who were doing epistemology professionally, all giving presentations there, and the general consensus among them seemed to be at the time that knowledge is justified true belief plus something else, and they were all arguing over what that something else is, and nobody could really agree as to what that something else was. Now, if you've been listening to the podcast for a long time, you might remember that probably about 1.5 years ago, I talked to Sarah Geiss on why sincerity isn't good enough, and her and I talked about Gettier problems a little bit then. That was way back in episode 14. So she actually put forth the idea that Gettier problems don't really affect epistemology because they're sort of disingenuous. They're conflating things in ways that they shouldn't. And she based that off a paper by, I believe it was Tim and Lydia McGrew. So that's an idea you might look at as well. The point I'm trying to get at here is that when you dive into epistemology, right now, the vast majority of the consensus seems to be that knowledge is justified true belief plus something else, and everyone's arguing over what the plus part is. Or you can kind of take the view that it is still justified true belief. And what I'm looking at this and thinking is, well, probably, if you do accept the Gettier problems, they'll throw you in doubt as to what knowledge is, but that's only like maybe 1 or 2% of the time. 98, 99% of the time, if you're just going off of justified true belief, that works very, very well. In fact, I'd submit to you, you probably know what it means to have knowledge of something in virtue of being a human being. Now, maybe you have a hard time articulating that in an analytic sense where you can say it's justified true belief plus this other thing, but most of the time I think you actually do pretty much know very well what knowledge is, and my evidence of that is you get through your daily life without killing or hurting yourself. And so here what I want to say is, I think for the most part, for most of us, 99% of the time, thinking of knowledge as justified true belief works very, very well, and you can use that just fine. There are some areas where that seems to get a little iffy, but still there, I think you probably have a good idea of what knowledge is. And the fact that Gettier was able to appeal to us and say, well, in these examples, I think there's something wrong with claiming that's knowledge, even though it counts as justified true belief. I think that shows us that we just kind of intuitively know what knowledge is. We just have a hard time expressing it in an analytically rigorous sense like the analytics want us to do. And that's just a case, I think, where analytic philosophy kind of meets its limits, because part of it's both a good blessing and a curse for analytic philosophy that it wants to define things in a very, very rigorous, thorough sense that works 100% of the time. Now, that's good in the sense that philosophy should be rigorous and thorough in everything that it can to be, but it's bad in the sense that there are some things in life that just really, really resist rigorous and thorough explanations and rigorous and thorough definitions, and those would be things like knowledge, good, evil, just some more abstract concepts like that we pretty much all recognize and I think are justified in doing so, but they just resist a good, thorough, rigorous analytic definition that works 100% of the time. So all that to say, for you to claim that you have knowledge, let's just say you have justified true belief. So then the question is, when it comes to experts and expertise, when are you justified in believing the experts? When is it a fallacious appeal to authority? What do you do when experts disagree? And so on and so forth. So to that first point, if you go look at a list of logical fallacies, you will often see appeal to authority listed as a logical fallacy. And that's because under some circumstances it absolutely is. When I was doing some research for this podcast, one of the articles I found was in a book on public health, and the blurb of the book actually said how we often need to do things that are informal logical fallacies in order to appeal to the public, and appeal to authority was one of the examples therein. Now, before dissenters get too excited and see, they're admitting they're using logical fallacies, well, there's a distinction between an informal fallacy and a formal fallacy. A formal fallacy is when you make a severe error in logic. I'm pretty sure I've talked about this on the podcast before, but when you're classifying arguments, there's the argument's form, and that is, if you could just translate it into numbers and letters or symbolic logic, that would be the argument's form, and then the content is what you're plugging in. So one that I like to use as an example all the time, you have if A then B, A so B. Well, that's the form of the argument. If I said plug something in like, if Spike is a cat, then Spike will be a mammal, then Spike is a cat, so Spike is a mammal. And there I just plugged content into it. So a formal fallacy is where there's something wrong with that form. These would be things like affirming the consequent or an illicit major. Affirming the consequent is actually one that we see all the time in argumentation. People use this all the time, and it is invalid. Here's an example of this I've just stumbled across on the internet. Somebody would say, if I have caffeine, I will be awake all night. I have been awake all night, therefore I had caffeine. Well, no, not necessarily. There could be any number of other reasons why you were awake all night. It could be that you're emotionally distressed. It could be that you listened to this podcast and decided that I'm horribly wrong and it causes you distress and you don't know what to do about it, so you're awake all night. So that's what a formal fallacy is. Conversely, informal fallacies, there's nothing wrong with the form of the argument. There's something else in the context of what's going on with the argument that makes it wrong. But there could be different contexts or different circumstances where the argument is not wrong, where it's not fallacious. One of the most common examples of the informal fallacy is post hoc fallacies, and that's where something occurs after something else. Therefore, you conclude that the first thing was the cause of the second thing. And I hope you can see why that's an informal fallacy, because sometimes that's not necessarily the case, but sometimes it is the case. Just easy example of this, there have been some times where after I've gone out to eat with my wife, I've had a pain in my stomach and felt like I've had food poisoning. And fortunately, most of the times I can think of that passed pretty quickly within just an hour or two. And so naturally I would assume, well, I got this pain in my stomach after I ate at this restaurant, therefore I got food poisoning from the restaurant. Now, maybe and maybe not. That's why that's an informal fallacy. That doesn't work deductively. There could be a whole host of other reasons why my stomach just happened to start hurting after I ate at the restaurant. The two might not be connected. I didn't demonstrate the necessary connection there. And this ties in a little bit to the distinction between deductive and inductive logic. Deductively, that's wrong. That's a formal fallacy. Inductively, I think you'd be justified in saying, well, maybe there's some connection there, and then going and looking for further evidence for the connection there. In that case, I don't know, maybe call the health inspector, sick him on that restaurant, and then read the paper a while later, or call back and say, hey, did you find anything? So I'm making this distinction here because it's important that appeal to authority is an informal fallacy. It's not a formal one, meaning it's not always wrong. It depends on the context and what you were doing. And the easiest and simplest way to explain that is appeal to authority is wrong when you're appealing to authorities that are not authorities on the subject matter, and it's right when you're appealing to people who are authorities on the subject matter. So you're trying to find out information on how a nuclear reactor works. You go get a book written by a nuclear physicist, or you happen to live in a town where a nuclear physicist teaches at a university, and you go to his office and talk to him. And then later on, when you're debating nuclear reactors with somebody, you refer back to that book or what that physicist told you. That's not an invalid appeal to authority. That's a very good appeal to authority, because the nuclear physicist would be a very good authority on nuclear reactors and subject matter like that. And generally and broadly speaking, that's how you do it. Your doctor is probably a pretty good authority on medicine. A lawyer that you could talk to is probably a pretty good authority on the law, and so on and so forth. A theologian will be a good authority on theology. An astrophysicist will be a pretty good authority on what goes on in stars out in the universe, and so on and so forth. Biologists, good authority on biology, and we can go on and on and on. Now, there is another distinction to bring up here, though, is that in a lot of these disciplines, there's subspecialties as well. So I often hear it thrown around that the vast majority of philosophers are atheists. Philosophers are the kind of people who think about religion and God and think about all these things rationally. Therefore, maybe you should be an atheist, because the vast majority of the people who think about it are. However, in philosophy, there's multiple sub-disciplines, as I've talked about. You can study epistemology, you can study philosophy of religion, you can study philosophy of mind, you can study philosophy of AI, you can study the philosophy of aesthetics, you can study the philosophy of science, you can study the philosophy of law, you can study political philosophy, and on and on and on it goes. So in that particular case, that's kind of a bad appeal to authority, because a philosopher who specializes in political philosophy, a philosopher who specializes in aesthetic philosophy, and one who specializes in philosophy of science, they're not necessarily going to be good experts on, say, the philosophical arguments for the existence of God. For that, you'd have to go to philosophers of religion. Now, there are some philosophers of religion who are atheists. Some of them are exceptionally intelligent, have stunningly good reputations for their academic work. Like there's a guy in Australia named Graham Oppy, who's an atheist, and theists have described him as scary smart. He's so good at what he does. But if you do poll philosophers who are in philosophy of religion, there you find the majority of them do believe in God in some sense or other. And so that's a slightly better appeal to authority, because then you're appealing to people in their relevant subject matter, but there's still something kind of, for lack of a better term, lazy about just appealing to the consensus within the field as opposed to doing the work yourself, if you can. The point of an appeal to authority is that none of us have the time, resources, and education, and so on and so forth, to go do and look into everything ourselves. We ultimately have to rely on the testimony of others for many things. I don't have the time, although some people do, to learn everything about how the inner workings of my car works. So when there's a problem with it, I take it to a mechanic, and I trust his expertise when he tells me what's going on with it. And if I doubt him, I'll take it to another mechanic and see what that guy says. That's me trusting the expertise of that mechanic, because in theory, I could take the time to learn all those things. I could read all the diagnostic manuals, I could start tinkering out with cars, and give it a couple of years, and I probably would get good enough that I could do most of that stuff on my own. I don't really have that time, or I don't want to spend that time doing that. I want to do other things, so I'll take it to a mechanic and rely on his expertise. But part of the point there is that, at least in theory, if I wanted to go do all that on my own, I could. Now, this gets much more difficult when you get into other fields that have a much higher barrier of entry, like medicine, geology, biology, and so on and so forth, where the people who are immensely qualified in that, it's not like I could just go tinker around with medicine for a couple of years and be on par with the most highly qualified and experienced doctors in the world. It doesn't work that way. You've got to go through a whole long process of education. You've got to go through residency, probably do fellowships in what subspecialty you're in, and get a lot of experience in practicing, and so on and so forth. It takes a lot of time and work. But the principle there is still the same. If a highly qualified physician, and since part of what brought me to do this podcast was people complaining that doctors don't know anything about the pandemic, take Dr. Fauci, for example. If he says something, and I appeal to his expertise to say that's the right thing to do. Dr. Fauci said this is the way the coronavirus works, this is a good response to it, he's an expert in the subject matter, therefore that's what we should do. Well, hiding behind that, part of the justification for that appeal to expertise is the idea that if I had the time, resources, knowledge, and education and training that Dr. Fauci does, I would probably come to the same conclusion or something very, very much like it. If I went and did all the work myself and had all access to the same data he did, I would come to more or less the same conclusion. That's part of the idea behind appeal to expertise. And that's also the reason why typically in a highly specialized field like medicine and virology and how epidemics spread and things like that, you would want to appeal to the consensus of experts as opposed to just one expert, because the idea there being, if there's 5, 10, 100, 500 experts who all have that knowledge, training, etc., and they all more or less agree on this, the odds that it's a good appeal to authority, and if you really went through and did all the work yourself, you would come to the same conclusion, very, 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 very high. So a practical, and I would hope pretty non-controversial example of this would be, say, with geology. Now, I've gotten to like a lot of state parks and national parks because I grew up in Montana out in the West, and I just like, my family went to all these things, and I like learning about, well, how do they date these rocks? These are the ones that the dinosaurs were in. That's what I was mostly interested in when I was a kid. When I graduated from Holy Apostles, my wife and I went there, and there's actually a place not too far from there, I think only about 30 or 40 miles from the school, where it's one of only a couple locations in the world where they have preserved dinosaur footprints. And I think it's a state park run by the state of Connecticut, but you can go there and look at them. They built a building over some of them, and they recovered some of them recovered some of them with dirt, that is, covered them over again so they wouldn't wear away. But it's pretty cool, and I was asking, like, the guy there, well, how do you go about dating these things, dating the rocks and stuff like that? And most of those questions of dating are pretty well firmly established in geology. At least if you talk to geologists, they're pretty well firmly established anyhow. And part of the problem you would run into, even if you did do geology and study it yourself, is there's so many different layers of rock, so many different kinds of rock, that you could never really do all the tests yourself, even if you had the expertise to do that. You'd just never be able to have the time and resource to test all the different layers of rock everywhere in the world and see what the conclusions you come to are. So that's why you have geologists studying rocks in Montana, some studying them in Connecticut, some studying them in Europe, some studying them in Asia, and on you go. And then they're all comparing results, and then when there's anomalies that show up, they try and figure out what's going on with the anomaly. Was it a test that went wrong, and so on and so forth. And so in many senses you have the experts checking their findings against the findings of other experts, and it's not the case that those always line up perfectly. There are anomalies, there are areas where the data doesn't quite fit, but you find that in every discipline and everything. There's always something that doesn't quite fit. But for the most part, when they find anomalies, they compare results and figure out where the problem is and get things kind of back within an acceptable margin. And that's kind of how all this stuff works, very loosely speaking. So the point here I'm making is that when I say I go to the Smithsonian Institute in Washington, D.C. at the Natural History Museum, and if I remember correctly, they have some rocks there that are dated to like 2 billion years old. Well, obviously, I didn't date those rocks myself. I mean, I was there at the museum, I saw the rocks, but it's not like I dated the rocks myself. It's not like I'm familiar with the methods and tests and how they did the dating. So if when I'm debating a young Earth creationist and I say, look, there's rocks that have been dated to 2 billion years ago, therefore, if you're going to claim God made the universe 6,000 years ago, you have a problem, because there's some stuff in a museum that we more or less know is older than 6,000 years. Well, is that a fallacious appeal to authority on my part? Well, I would want to say no, because hiding behind that appeal to authority I just made is the idea that if I were to go through and do all that dating, the methods and testing and so on and so forth myself on that rock, I'd come to more or less the same conclusion. You know, it doesn't have to be exactly. Like maybe they dated it to 2.1 billion years and my date came out to 2.05 or something like that. But roughly speaking, I would come to something like the same conclusion. And then if you have a consensus of geologists, multiple geologists who dated that same rock, and they all came to more or less the same conclusion, then your confidence in that should go up. It should grow. You should be able to say, well, yeah, it's very unlikely that this many experts got it wrong. And obviously, if we're talking about the age of the Earth and the age of rocks, geology is an appropriate discipline to look to and appeal to, so it's not like I'm going outside of the specialty and appealing to the wrong authority. If, say, instead of appealing to a geologist for that, I appealed to a biologist or a philosopher, well, that would probably be a fallacious appeal to authority, because those aren't good authorities on the age of rocks. Geologists are. Now, some of this actually comes back to a point that Thomas Reid, who was a Scottish philosopher, I believe he was a contemporary of David Hume, if I remember right, but he was a much better philosopher than David Hume. This is kind of a tangent, but Peter Razor actually talked to me about Thomas Reid way back when I first talked to him on Molinism a long time ago. Anyhow, Thomas Reid had this idea, which is he had a whole epistemology that was worked out called common sense realism, but part of that is the idea that the vast majority of the things we know by the way of testimony. I haven't dated the rock myself. I'm taking the testimony of the experts who do. I have never measured the distance from the Earth to the Moon. If I want to know that, I'm taking the testimony of the experts who do. And if you really stop and think about it, the vast, vast, vast majority of the things we know are things that we know by some form of testimony. And in point of fact, now that we live in a time and world where there's so much mass media and mass communication, you're getting more testimony all the time, because I'd actually want to argue, to some extent, maybe not the same, but to some extent, It's a form of testimony, even when you're watching the news and they're reporting on what's happened. Even if they've got video evidence of it, you're not there observing it. You're observing the video evidence that was taken of that. And it's been shown multiple times that that can be faked, and sometimes it has been faked pretty well. I mean, I've seen movies with great CGI. How do you really know that the news media isn't CGIing that particular video of, say, that car crash or that riot or something like that? Well, there's all kinds of good rational reasons why you should reject an argument like that, and generally say, if the news media is reporting this event or something very much close to it probably happened, because it's just a better and easier explanation than, hey, they're making it up. So as a general rule, you should probably believe the testimony of what people tell you. Believe that they're telling you the truth as best as they can. That goes back to that principle of charity that I've talked about on here before. Believe, for the most part, that people, they believe what they're telling you, and they're not trying to deceive you in the absence of reasons to think that. And part of the reason you want to do that is if you're going to say you have to be skeptical of testimony, well, you're going to have to be skeptical of the vast majority of things you believe, because the vast majority of things we believe that we think are important, we believe on the basis of testimony. I believe in God. I believe that Christ was the Son of God who died and rose again on the third day for the forgiveness of our sins. But I wasn't there when that happened. I believe that on testimony, more or less. And you're going to find it for the same in the vast majority of things that you believe that you think are of importance. Whatever position you take, you have to believe a lot of it on testimony. And often the testimony of people who are experts in those areas. Another example of this is about 2 years ago, maybe 2.5, I read a book called The Obesity Code that argued, among other things, that the reason many people are so obese is we eat way too much wheat and way too much sugar, and the way simple carbohydrates are now worked into our food has changed about 50 years ago, and that's a bad thing to do. And it was written by a doctor, but he's also a minority in the medical community, as I understand it. Most people don't buy his ideas, but I read his book and I thought, oh, this makes sense. So I started doing that. I stopped eating wheat and stopped eating sugar for the most part, and it's actually worked very well for me. Now, he cites many studies and much data in that book where he's saying, oh, this study showed this study showed this study showed this about insulin when it's high, this study showed this about insulin when it's low, this study showed this about the glycemic index, and all these other things. Well, I didn't do any of those studies. I'm taking this doctor's word for it. And furthermore, for the vast majority of those studies, that doctor didn't do them either. He looked them up and, using his expertise as a doctor, evaluated, well, this data's good, this study's flawed. He included the ones that he thought supported his position, that he thought were good, and cited them. But other people did those studies. He's taken their testimony and believed it, then I've taken his testimony and believed it, and so on and so forth. Now this brings up 2 points, the second of which I'll get to later, and that's, well, what do you do when the experts disagree, when there isn't consensus or overwhelming consensus? But the first point, and this is the one that made me think of doing this whole podcast, is that sometimes you do need actually some relevant expertise in order to evaluate the data and know what's, say, good data there, good science there, and what's pseudoscience and what's bad data. Now, in the case of, say, a medical issue like weight loss, like why are more people obese than not, and what can we do about it? There, I think it's perfectly obvious that a doctor who studied medicine, especially if he's like specialized in nutrition or other aspects of medicine that focus pretty much on weight gain and obesity and things like that, he's in a much better position to understand and evaluate the data than I am. Or than probably you are, unless you happen to be a doctor like that yourself. Because a large part of what you come to realize when you get into the nitty-gritty of studying a discipline is there's procedures and norms and modus operandi, or normal modes of operating, that apply to various disciplines that don't apply to other disciplines. A good part of how you think properly is learning, well, what's relevant data, what's noise, what's very important data, what's secondary, what even is the important data for this type of discipline. And that's the kind of thing that you pretty much only learn as you're doing the discipline, as you're getting educated in it, and as you're experiencing it. For example, since my discipline is philosophy, I can tell you quite honestly that the vast majority of philosophical discussion that goes on the internet is barely philosophical, and most of it's pretty much just white noise that isn't relevant and doesn't really have much to do. The vast majority of questions that people ask initially are things that have been easily answered by philosophers for a long period of time. I don't mean by saying this that the vast majority of people are stupid. I mean the vast majority of people are simply uneducated in philosophy and don't really know what they're talking about. The distinction there is that everybody deals with philosophical questions. You kind of have to live in life. Not everybody has to deal with geology and medicine all the time, although since we're all going to get sick, we have to deal with medicine in some sense, but it's not exactly the same thing. And so, as I've learned more about philosophy, I've learned what the formal and informal fallacies are, why there's a distinction between formal and informal fallacies, how to recognize what a good argument is, how to recognize what a good theory is, and how to recognize what a bad argument is and what a bad theory is, which has then enabled me to say, look at theories like the one the guy proposed in the obesity code and go, that might not be right, but it's a good theory because it's coherent, it fits with the available data, at least as best as I can see, and it explains some things pretty well that the other theories don't. Like, it explains very well how it is that people will try so hard to lose weight and not be able to. It explains that very well, and so that seems like a better theory, because that's part of philosophy, is understanding and learning, well, what's a good theory, what's a good idea, what's a good argument, and what's not. And that's really one of the reasons why I love doing philosophy so much, is because although I'm not an expert in any one of these fields, I can usually get a sense after learning how to recognize fallacies and what a good theory is and what a bad theory is, who's an expert who probably knows what they're talking about and who's one who's just blowing smoke and has no idea what they're talking about and is not really an expert. If you have an expert who's espousing logical fallacies and saying theories that don't make sense, they might not be such of an expert. Now, not necessarily. People make mistakes, but you should probably start being suspicious of them at that point. So, when, say, and going back to the dating of the rock example, when, say, somebody who isn't educated in geology turns around and says, aha, they made a mistake in this type of dating. Carbon-14 dating doesn't work, etc., and here's the reasons why. And then you realize, well, this person's not a geologist. And then you go ask the actual geologist, well, what's this person saying? And they're like, no, he's totally wrong. He just doesn't even understand how this dating method works. That's a normal way of doing things, and for him to criticize that shows that he doesn't know what he's talking about. Well, then you know there's something wrong there. And likewise, it's very, very similar with the skepticism some people are showing about what the medical community is saying about COVID in the ongoing pandemic. That is, I have actually had the unfortunate experience of interacting with some people on the internet who are literally telling me that they know better than the doctors do about what the mortality rate of COVID is, how many people are infected with it, how severe it is, and on and on and on they go. Now, in some of those cases, those people actually do have the knowledge where they can go look up, say, various studies that have been done in medical journals. Now, some of these journals are high quality, some are low quality, and so on and so forth. But the problem there is, if you haven't been to medical school, and you're not familiar with how doctors write their research, and you're not familiar with things like sample sizes, you're not familiar with the normal means of doing things when you're studying things like virology and epidemics and things along those lines, it would be very, very, very easy for you to read a medical journal, medical article, and take completely the wrong conclusion, because you're not familiar with the field. You don't understand what the norms are, so you might read something and think, oh, this is horrifically wrong, when it's actually just right. A good example of this that comes to mind just now is if you read any of the popular level books by the popular agnostic / atheistic New Testament scholar Bart Ehrman, he plays with this all the time. I've heard him do this in debates he's done, and I've seen him do it in a couple of his books at least. He'll do things like he'll go through and say, the first gospel wasn't even composed until at least 30 years after Jesus was crucified. They had to tell the stories over and over and over again until that time period. Many of the people would have died. There's differences in the stories between the Gospels. How many angels were at the tomb? It depends on which Gospel you read, and on and on and on he'll go. Now, if you're not familiar with the world of New Testament scholarship, some of those things might sound very, very distressing to you. Wait, 30 years went by between the first Gospel and Christ's crucifixion? That seems like a long time. How do I know they got everything right? However, when you are familiar with the discipline, what you actually realize is the things that he's castigating as check marks against the New Testament and the Gospels are actually check marks in their favor. The reason why there's an apparent discrepancy between the number of angels at Jesus' tomb when the women go there is because we have multiple accounts of Jesus' resurrection and crucifixion and his ministry. You very, very rarely have multiple accounts in any other historical thing from that long ago. Most of the time you only have one account, and most of the time the earliest that we have it from is sometimes even hundreds of years after the fact. Like the best biographies of Alexander the Great were written 400 years after he died. So if you're not familiar with all those facts, you don't understand how those things work, you're going to hear Ehrman do that and go, oh my, this is terrible, I can't trust the Gospels. But as soon as you've actually immersed yourself in the discipline, you're going to realize, that guy's being disingenuous here. Those aren't bad points. Those are good points, because when I compare the New Testament documents and the Gospels to other literature that would be similar, other ancient literature, other accounts that purport to be saying historical things, the New Testament fares far, far better than they do. So, what you can take from that is, if you're going around reading articles that purport to say, here's how the government is getting COVID wrong, here's how it's not really as deadly as they're saying, here's how everything they've done is wrong. Well, look at who wrote it. If it's a journalist who's interviewing a doctor who's saying those things, that might be credible. If it's somebody on the internet who's just looked at some research, even if it seems to be good research, but has no medical training, isn't a doctor, isn't familiar with all these things, then you should probably be pretty skeptical, because it's going to be very, very easy for them to get a lot of things wrong, because they're not immersed in the discipline, they're not immersed in the field. And that's how you wind up with things like a guy on the internet who was telling me he knows more about the COVID pandemic than the doctors do. Another example of this is when it's reported sometimes that, say, the cops had to shoot this suspect or whatever, you'll sometimes read in that, say, the cops fired 40 rounds into this guy, or something similar along those lines. Now, somebody who doesn't know anything about guns will think, oh, that's horrific. You don't need 40 bullets to stop somebody. Somebody who actually knows a thing or two about weapons and fire rates and things like that knows that's no big deal. That's normal. If you have 5 cops chasing a guy, he turns around and pulls a gun on them, and they all shoot, they could unload 40 rounds in 2 or 3 seconds, because that's how fast a lot of weapons can shoot. So, to somebody who's unfamiliar with how weapons work, that'll sound horrific and brutal. To somebody who's familiar with how weapons work, they'll think, well, that's normal. That's the way weapons work. That's not an indication that this was a horrific brutality. That's an indication that there was a firefight. So, let me go back to that second problem then, which is, well, what do you do when the experts disagree? And here I think you should say, what do you do? Here I think we should clarify, what do you do when there's significant disagreement among the experts? Because in any field you look at, any discipline, you're always going to find crackpots who say insane things. There's somebody who published in New Testament Jesus studies who actually published that Jesus is an alien from a certain planet and gave them all names and things like that. Total crackpot, total nonsense. There are people in New Testament studies who try to claim that Jesus never existed, and one of them actually has a PhD from a university in the relevant subject matter. Total nonsense. Way outside of the extreme. 99.9% of people who study the historical Jesus in New Testament would reject those wholesale, and be right to do so. Those are the extreme weird things. So, when somebody says something that's very, very extreme and weird, even if they're a relevant expert, you can probably discount it. Like, I forget how long ago this was, but people were trying to send me this video and asking me what I thought about it. But there were a group of, I think, about like 10 doctors who were actual medical doctors who were in Washington, D.C., I think in front of the White House. And they were trying to claim things like, oh, the COVID thing isn't that real. The government's stopping us from treating people with, I think I'm going to mispronounce these, chloroquine and hydroxychloroquine. Those, there was some question of whether they might be an effective treatment early on, but then some more studies came out and said, no, in fact, it's probably going to increase your risk, so don't use it. And so on. And they were claiming other things like that. In fact, I think Facebook and YouTube took the video down because they said there's so much misinformation in this. And this is kind of a side note, but I really wish big tech wouldn't do those kind of things, because when they do, it feeds into the persecution complex that minority fringe groups have and says, see, we're being oppressed, therefore we're right. Now, they're not right, but deleting those videos and taking them down and stuff like that doesn't help anything. It just feeds into the conspiracy narrative and gives people who think like that justification for their irrationality. So that aside, the problem in this particular case is you have people who seem to be relevant experts, that is, they are medical doctors, who are claiming things that are very, very much outside the norm. So what do you do with that? Well, in that particular case, you can kind of dismiss them, because when you dig into their credentials, you find out that while they are medical doctors, they're not specialized in treating things like a pandemic or treating COVID, and there's a lot of wackiness going on there. So that's what I mean by that's not a significant disagreement. They're outside the norm. A significant disagreement would be something more like somebody saying, I think the COVID virus has a 0.6% fatality rate, and another doctor saying, no, I think it's 0.4. Or, probably a better example, a significant disagreement would be in quantum physics. There's vastly different interpretations that are possible of quantum physics. If I recall correctly, there are 10 different ones, many of which contradict each other. And you go ask a quantum physicist, well, which interpretation is right? You're going to get any one of those 10 range of answers, because nobody knows. Well, that's significant disagreement, because none of them know. None of the experts can settle on which one is the right interpretation, even though, from what I understand, many of them will go to the mat arguing for their interpretation. So if you've got experts who disagree like that, what do? Well, the easy answer to that, if it's something like quantum physics, is you're not an expert in the matter, just remain agnostic and say, well, I don't know. But that's easy to do with quantum physics, because that doesn't affect your life. What if it's something much closer to affecting your life? Like, I'm sure if you've been listening to the podcast for a long time, you might have had a doubt in the back of your mind saying, wait, Phil, you're saying we should trust experts and we should trust the consensus of experts. Isn't the consensus of experts who have education in the appropriate fields that evolution is a true theory, that it is the right way to go, and you've said before that you're skeptical on it? Yes, I have said that I'm skeptical on it, but it is also true that the consensus of experts in biology, evolutionary biology, and many of the other relevant disciplines is that the Darwinian theory of evolution is true. So then how can I claim some skepticism on it? Well, toward the end of his book on scientism, J.P. Moreland lays out some criteria for when it's okay to be skeptical of the consensus of experts. Now, two of these are, the criteria he lays out are specific to Christianity, which, well, it certainly would apply to me. I don't think it applies in general to what I'm trying to do here, so I'm just going to leave those off, and I'm going to read you his middle two here. So, he's more or less saying, you're okay in being skeptical of the consensus of experts in a given field if it meets these two criteria. First, he says, there's the presence of a band of highly trained, academically qualified scholars with a good track record for publishing in top journals or with highly regarded book publishers, and who are unified in rejecting the view, e.g. the blind watchmaker thesis, the key issue, and there he means the key issue of evolution, and perhaps the thesis of common descent, again a key issue in evolution, held by even a vast majority of the relevant experts. And the other criteria that's relevant here is, he says, there are good historical, sociological, or theological explanations for why the expert majority holds to the problematic view, in this case evolution, instead of their adherence to the problematic view being largely a rational commitment based on a lot of good arguments and strong evidence. Now, Moreland goes on to argue that he thinks we have those two criteria in the instance of evolution, and we have those two criteria met with advocates for intelligent design, who he says are academically qualified, do have the relevant training and the relevant subject matter, have published scientifically and philosophically rigorous books arguing against these things, and occasionally in journals, although they typically get rejected. And that you can explain, at least somewhat, the consensus of experts being that evolution is true by sociological, historical, and other philosophical means, meaning that's what people want to be true. It's a little more complicated, but more or less that. Now, I think we could take the first criteria he mentioned there and just basically say, look, if there are experts who really are experts, who do have the required qualifications, who do have the academic training and knowledge and so on and so forth, who have also demonstrated that they're capable of doing the good research themselves, who have significant dissenting opinions, and it's more than just a couple, that is, it's a significant group. It's more than, say, the 10 doctors who were at the White House. Well then, that gives you good cause. And couple that with the idea that the consensus opinion, that you can explain people holding that for reasons that are not rational and discipline orientated, well, then you've got a good cause to reject the consensus view. So how this might work in, say, a less controversial example is, let's say you were living in the Soviet Union 50 years ago, and you were trying to study economics. It could very well easily be the case that you'd only be allowed to study Marxist or Marxist-like or socialist-like forms of economics, and that any access you got to, say, capitalism or mercantilism or other economic models was either very, very limited or very, very distorted to make it appear very, very bad. Now, us sitting outside that, we're going to look at that and go, well, the consensus of experts then would be wrong. But at the same time, wouldn't you want to say that if you were in that position, you would be justified in appealing to the consensus of experts? So how do you solve that problem? And that's what Moreland is attempting to do here. In the case of the Soviet Union, well, you might not have access to them because of your position in the world, but there certainly is a group of people who study economics who's significant and large in number and has all the appropriate qualifications and training and education, who says that no, Marxist and communistic forms of economies are terrible and just bring death and suffering. It's also the case that you can easily explain why in the Soviet Union there would be a consensus toward Marxism and communist forms of economics, apart from the rigors of the discipline of economics. Now, at the same time, although Moreland doesn't do this in his book, I think you can turn that on its head a little bit and say, well, what about when there's a minority in a particular field who's arguing against the consensus? How do you evaluate them when it's more than 10 people, when it's significant? And you can look at that and explain it the same way, which is, well, the people who are in the consensus, do they have all that necessary training? And if you dig into it deep, can they back up what they're saying? Can they give you good arguments and reasons? Can they explain what the objections are? If they can do that. And then you might want to look and say, well, is there an explanation for why this minority, why this group that rejects the consensus, is there some explanation for what they're doing that seems to be outside the discipline? Is there some sociological, historical, philosophical, or religious reason why they're doing that? And in the case of people who seem to be trying to say, well, COVID isn't very deadly, it seems to me there's a pretty clear answer there, that the vast majority of them are very, very politically orientated toward the political right. Now, I tend to be orientated toward the political right myself. I'm not saying that's necessarily bad. But they're mostly trying to view it, they mostly seem to have come to view it through the lens of politics, and they're like, well, we have to make this political, and the president tried to downplay it, that means it can't be that big of a deal. That is, you can find a reason outside of what the discipline, the rules and rigor of rationality and so on and so forth, why these people are dissenting voices. And couple that with the fact that the vast majority of them who are the dissenting voices don't have the expertise. And in this particular case, if you listen to the dissenting voices talking about this, the vast majority of them will flat out tell you it's all about politics and all about how the Democrats are trying to do this or the Democrats are trying to do that. which again tells me they're letting something outside of what their expertise is, outside of the MO of the discipline, come in and influence what they're thinking about. And that's something that should be avoided, but to be fair, it's very, very hard to do that. It requires a good deal of self-discipline, and it's very hard to do that, especially in America nowadays, where politics seems to have invaded and ruined everything. So, this has kind of gone on a little longer than I thought, but let me just sum up for you here. Appeal to authority is not always a fallacy. It's listed as an informal fallacy for that reason, because it's a fallacy or a good argument depending on the context and why you're doing it. If, as a general rule, you're appealing to an authority who is relevant, who is within his discipline, who knows the subject matter, then that's probably a good appeal to authority. That's made even stronger by when it's an appeal to the consensus of experts within that discipline, the consensus of authority. The reason behind why it's a good appeal to authority is the idea that you just don't have the time and resources to go do everything yourself. You've got to depend on some people's testimony. And so you can depend on their testimony, because if you went and did all the research and all the testing, etc., yourself, you'd come to more or less the same conclusion as that expert or that consensus of experts. In cases where there is a significant disagreement between experts, where there isn't really a consensus, or where there's a minority group that's making pretty well argued and evidence claims, well then, for the most part, if you're not an expert in that field, you should be agnostic about that and say, I don't know, unless you have to make a decision. There's some things in life where you have to make a decision. You don't have to make a decision about which interpretation of quantum physics is right. You probably are going to have to make decisions about how you're dealing with COVID and the pandemic. You are going to have to make a decision about things like, well, was Jesus really God? Those are important questions. You have to deal with them. So in cases where you can't reasonably maintain any type of agnosticism, well, then the best thing to do is to do your best to dive into the details and not be lazy and figure it out yourself. One of the reasons why I talked about how appeal to consensus, even among philosophers of religion, is kind of lazy is that, well, with the philosophical arguments for the existence of God, some of them can get very, very complicated, but for the most part, most of them are pretty easy to understand, and the average person, if they put the effort in, they could more or less understand them and come to some kind of reasonable, thought-out conclusion on the matter. And if they don't, and they just appeal to the consensus of experts, well, that's probably pretty lazy. And likewise, it's lazy if you just read the arguments one time, wholesale rejected them, and didn't go into detailed defenses and analysis of them that it might answer what your objections are. And it's lazy on the other side if you read them once or twice, wholesale accepted them, and didn't go read guys like Graham Oppy try and demolish them. And maybe I'm harping on my own discipline a little too much there, but that's one of the things that I think is great about philosophy is there really are some experts in philosophy, and you should listen to what they have to say. But if you put the effort and time in and spend years doing it, you can actually become an expert in philosophy yourself. People have done that. But failing to be able to do that, most of us can't do that with things like medicine and geology and biology and so on and so forth. What you should do then is, if you see that there's the field's in a position where there either isn't consensus or there's that minority group like J.P. Moreland's talking about, is you should look for, say, are there other things going on in this field? Are there other reasons besides the evidence and the rationality and the arguments why people would be making arguments like this? In the example of the Soviet Union, there clearly is. And J.P. Moreland argues there is in the case of evolution. Maybe sometimes there is, maybe there's not. I'm not as committed on that as he is there. And then if it's a case where you can't maintain agnosticism, you've just got to figure out, well, what's the best I can do here? And maybe, rather than just making the decision and moving on with your life, try digging into the literature on the subject, doing research on the subject matter yourself, because that'll enhance your ability to get the answer right. So, all that to say, when people appeal to the experts to talk about the COVID pandemic, it's not a fallacy that they do that. That's perfectly appropriate. When people on the internet are saying, I know more than the doctors do, no, they don't, and they're almost certainly getting it wrong because they don't have the expertise and knowledge and training to understand the evidence that is out there. They, most of the time, probably don't even know where to go to find the good evidence. They don't understand which medical journals are the high ones and which ones are the fluff ones. Now, if those people really wanted to really go to bat for their claims, they could go to medical school, go through residency, go through a fellowship, go through all the training, practice medicine for a while, and then still make their claims. And, then I think we'd be forced to take them a little more seriously if they still made the same claims. But I highly, highly suspect they wouldn't still be making the same claims if they went through all that, because that's the whole point of a good appeal to authority. So, now it's your turn to write in and let me know what you think. What do you think about appeal to authority? What do you think about my explanations for it? And do you think I'm right or wrong? Write in and let me know. You can reach me for any kind of comment at theexaminedlifewithphil@gmail.com, or check out the Facebook page I set up for the group, The Examined Life with Phil. Just do a search for it and you'll find it. And I will be back again with something else for you in 2 weeks' time.
Hello, God's beloved. I'm Annabelle Mosley, author, professor of theology, and host of Then Sings My Soul and Destination Sainthood on WCAT Radio. I invite you to listen in and find inspiration along this sacred journey we're traveling together to make our lives a masterpiece and, with God's grace, become saints. Join me, Annabelle Mosley, for Then Sings My Soul and Destination Sainthood on WCAT Radio. God bless you. Remember, you're never alone. God is always with you.
To a production of WCAT Radio, please join us in our mission of evangelization. And don't forget, love lifts up when knowledge takes flight.